So hopefully, hang on just a second here. You can all see my screen.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, first, let me just say thanks for the invite again. I appreciate it, and I've enjoyed listening to all the presentations. Mine's going to take you obviously in a little bit of a different direction and build off of what I did last year, which was look at a more general, and I decided this time to talk about some specific people that are going to take us end of the 19th century into the early 20th, which I realize is a little outside of, but it's recognizing one of the difficulties in looking at women's participation in the game. As I mentioned to you before, there are actually literally, as I'm finding out, a few hundred women's baseball teams playing in the 19th century of varying qualities. Problem is that very few of them mention in any significant way players' names or players, anything about them, except for occasionally a star. And so that's, I'm going to focus on a few today, just to give you a little bit of a feel for some of them. Couple advertisements here just to sort of put us in the time frame. The one on the left is from newspaper in 1885. This was the sort of thing that you saw a lot of. The Young Ladies Baseball Club was a very common name for many different clubs in different cities, all having the same name. Queens of the Emerald Diamond, as you can see, the Bells of the Bat, and my favorite one, and I'm being sarcastic there, Fairies of the Field. So a little bit of a different approach. The middle picture ties very directly to the picture on the right. The picture on the right is who I'm going to start by talking about, and that's Lizie Arlington. Picture of her in 1898. But the picture in the middle is an interesting one because this comes from a 1902 paper from the New England Bloomer team. And this is Grace Woods, woman out of Florida who is going to join that team that year. And what's interesting about her is she actually attended Vassar College, which of course the Vassar Resolutes are the very first women's baseball team we tend to think of from the 1860s. And so she attended for 2 years at the end of the 19th century and actually played on a internal team at Vassar in 1898 and 99. And so then was going to be joining the New England Bloomers with Lizie Arlington in 1902. And that's important because of what we do or do not know about Lizie Arlington, which I'll talk about here in a second. But Lizie Arlington was her name when she played baseball, but her actual real name was Elizabeth Stride. You'll sometimes see it spelled as Stroud as well in articles. They never quite got it right. There's a couple other spellings, but those are the most common. But she decided once her career really started to take off to go with the name Arlington because it sounded fancier. And so she just liked it. And so she chose Arlington. She was the youngest of 6, and her father, Henry, was the one who encouraged her to get involved in sports. Baseball was not the only one. She liked pretty much anything. There are articles about her being, she was from Mahanoy City in Pennsylvania, and read at least 2 articles where she was supposedly the first woman to ever ride a bicycle in the city. I'm not sure how they know that, but that's what the article would say. She was also on a local polo team, which is kind of fascinating. And there are a bunch of articles about her doing trap and skeet shooting and becoming quite good at that as well. But baseball was really where she made her mark. And most people talk about her as playing in 1898, and that's pretty much it. But actually, she started in 1892, as I have quite a few articles with her playing with the Cincinnati Ladies. They're actually called the Cincinnati Reds Ladies Club. And sometimes the articles leave off the ladies part and it just says the Cincinnati Reds are playing, and you go and you read it thinking, oh, and then you discover it's a women's baseball team. And then she played also for the New York Stars and the Young Ladies Baseball Club in the mid 1890s. The description on the bottom there about her baseball costume and things is from 1898, so you could read that. But where we tend to focus on her career is in July of 1898. And she played for the Philadelphia Reserves for much of that year. Pitching, usually she'd start a game and then move to second base. And so in early July, she played in a game, gave up 6 hits and 3 runs, which moved her immediately to second base. But the July 5th game is the one that is usually what she gets most credit for when she played for the Reading Coal Heavers against the Allentown Peanuts, which is a minor league game. And she was brought in the ninth inning to see how she would do. And she gave up 2 hits, walked 1, so she loaded the bases, but managed to get out of the inning with no runs being scored, which again gave her future opportunities, just a few. Most books then say, most articles that anybody has tried to write about her say she disappears from the baseball scene. That is not true. She continues to play through 1902. And so that earlier piece about the New England Bloomer Girls. After her career's over, she ends up marrying George Warner, stays around the area in Pennsylvania where she grew up, becomes a purchasing agent for an import-export business, and then died pretty early after a little bit of a botched surgery, it appears, in 1919. And so that sort of gives you her trajectory. Here are a couple of other articles. This one on the left is from 1895, showing that she was playing. And you can see the team consists of Lizie Arlington, champion female pitcher of the world. And I heard somebody say earlier today with other teams that there's no process for that. You just got to name yourself that. And so that's what she did. And so did some of the others that were playing at the time. And you can see some names listed there. This is one of the few articles that you can find where there are actual other names and actual first and last names. Tracking them down beyond that is a bit difficult. The article on the right is the same kind of idea. I wanted to show you some of the names of the players. That's from 1892. So here are her earliest. And you can see here Lizie Arlington as the catcher on the team, which often happened, the star player. She caught, played first base, second base, and pitched, with pitching and first base being her primary positions. Couple other advertisements for her. The one on the top right became the most common one that was used. Broadsides put up to sort of give her credit as always the star and the famous lady pitcher. And then there are going to be a few efforts, as becomes common, where others will try to claim that same title and challenge that title. But Lizie Arlington is credited with being one of the first to play in a minor league game. And so that 1898 game is the one that is important. And you can see the change in her uniform from the long skirt to the bloomers. So she kind of went back and forth, but eventually adopted the bloomers on a more regular basis. It was easier to play than wearing the skirt, as we can all imagine. Okay. And so just to come, this is a rare one on the left where you can find an actual box score of a women's game. There aren't a whole lot of those out there, but occasionally you find one, and you can see Arlington listed as the pitcher there in that game. Game was only played for 7 innings. And then the other is an advertisement. Again, these are July of 1898, the period when she was pitching exhibition games, mostly for the Philadelphia, the Reading Reserves, or the Philadelphia Reserves, and some other teams. Okay. So one example, I wanted to talk a little bit just to broaden our perspective, and this takes us a little out of the 20th century into the early, or out of the 19th and the early 20th, to look at an umpire, female umpire. First female umpire that we recognize is Amanda Clement, born in Nebraska in 1888, died in 1971, umpired between 1904 and 1911, so right after the turn of the century. Was at a game with her brother and her mother, and her brother was playing and umpire didn't show up. And her brother Hank suggested that they invite her to umpire. You can probably imagine how that initially went. But he insisted. He basically said, if you want my equipment and you want me to play, then my sister gets to umpire. And that's basically how she got her start. And they discovered almost immediately that she knew what she was doing, and she actually knew the game probably better than others. And so that began a career that lasted. As you can see, she umpired about 50 games a year, averaging between $15 and $25 a game. She refused to umpire on Sundays. And she also, in one of her own interviews, said that never really had much problem with the male ball players, contrary to what people would expect. They generally, even when they argued with her, would say, "Are you sure about that strike, ma'am?" But she was also not afraid to throw out a ball player, and she estimated in her career, that she threw out 6 ball players, which isn't a lot, but maybe that's all it needed, was to show that she was willing to do that. She used the money that she got from umpiring to pay her way through college, and she graduated from the University of Nebraska with a phys ed degree, and so worked for a number of years in that field. And then after she decided to make a switch in career after her mother died, and she moved into social work, which she did for 25 years, retiring in the late 1960s. You can see a couple of quotes there, one from an article in her own scrapbook. She umpired the game as quietly and easily as other young women would sweep a floor or make a cake. That's actually a very common phrase that was used, that comparing their abilities on the baseball field, if they were good, to what a proper woman did at home, right? And then possessor of an eagle eye, seldom makes a mistake. And that was the kind of coverage that she did get a lot of, that she was very well respected. They saw her as somebody that they could count on. What I find fascinating is, as I was looking at building a story about Amanda Clement, which I had published before, ran across another young female umpire that nobody knew about, who's umpired in 1911. Her name is Madge Jones. And so I'm trying to build that picture now of a second, because we've never heard of her before. And normally it goes from Amanda Clement to the 1960s, and we don't see a female umpire in between at this kind of level. And so Amanda Clement, kind of unique in that respect. Probably one of the ones I find the most fascinating, maybe simply because having lived here in Ohio now for a long time, Alta Weiss is from Ragersville, Ohio, which is just south of where I live. Very, very small town of about 100 people. And that's still what it is. It was what it was when she was there. It's the home also of Lois Youngin, who played in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League and knew Alta Weiss, and Alta helped sort of push Lois into baseball. Lois went on to be a catcher. But Alta Weiss, rather a unique story, gets her start playing baseball in 1907 for the Vermilion Independents. Her father, doctor in Ragersville, really supported her efforts, and he claims that he recognized that she was going to be a good pitcher at the age of 2, when he claims he saw her throw a rock at a bird and she hit it. And that's when he knew that she was going to be. Those are the kind of apocryphal stories that get told, right? But anyway, he ended up doing a couple things to help support her career. He built a gymnasium essentially on their farm, where she could practice her pitching all year round, and put a fireplace in it and things, so during the winter she could continue to pitch. And then he essentially helped create a high school baseball team for their town, so that she would have a team to play on. They typically took their summer vacations up in Vermilion, and that's where she sort of got discovered by the mayor, H.P. Williams, who convinced the manager of the Vermilion Independents, Charles Heidloff, to put her on the team, because he said their star pitcher had gotten hurt and they were coming up to a big tournament and they needed somebody to draw in the fans and things like that. And H.P. Williams saw her essentially playing catch with a bunch of the boys and thought, ooh, 17 years old, this would be the pitcher. And so she became known as the Girl Wonder. That was her own title that she used. Her very first win came in 1907 against the Sandusky Shamrocks. She pitched a couple exhibition games that year in League Park. In 1908, her dad decided she should get to travel the country, so he bought a team for her. Essentially, it was most of the Vermilion Independents, renamed it the Weiss All-Stars. And in one of those games in 1908, this is really unique. We have a couple articles where she got challenged, and then the game actually took place. Two female pitchers pitching against one another. Irma Grable, from the same Tuscarawas County in Ohio that Alta Weiss was from, pitched against Weiss, claimed that she was going to beat her, and Weiss beat her. There was another challenge that came from a young lady out of Cleveland. Her name was Carista Mesteller. That game never actually took place, but Alta Weiss, as often happened, sort of encouraged these challengers. She went on to the College of Worcester and then the Starling School of Medicine, graduated and took over her father's practice eventually. Continued to play through the 1911 season. Lots and lots of articles talking about her arm and whether or not, as you can see, she was going to have the stamina to pitch all the time. Was she really strong enough? Could she actually pitch the number of innings they needed her to? I read an entire article. It was a full-length page in the newspaper, and it didn't once mention what she was like as a pitcher. It actually was all about, if you touch her arm, you'll feel the muscle in her arm, and you'll discover that it's really not anything bigger than what you would expect for any pitcher. And it just goes, and that's all it's about. So these are the kinds of stories you see. There's the Weiss All-Stars. That's the team her dad created for her so she could play. She was so popular in her hometown that the year she was supposed to graduate from high school, they actually changed the commencement date because she had a game that she was supposed to pitch in Dayton, and they wanted her to be at commencement. So they actually changed the date so she could do both. She happened to win that game in Dayton. So it was a good move on their part. And so Alta Weiss, in Ragersville today, they turned the basement of the church into a museum, and it's all about Alta Weiss. So you can find a variety of things about Alta there. And then I wanted to just show you, so here's the girl pitches with a shapely arm. That was the headline for that article I was telling you about. And so I also pointed out this other article because you'll notice towards the bottom that she was the pitcher, but she would be relieved often by Edward Youngin or Henry Youngin, who were the brothers of Lois, who went on to play, I shouldn't say that, father and uncle, sorry, of Lois Youngin. And so one of the families in the same hometown. And then this was one of the other popular articles that appeared a lot of trying to catch her in different, the only thing they said she wasn't very good at was hitting. She was a good fielder. She was a good pitcher. One article describes her as all she could do was take the bat and push it at the ball. And she didn't really know how to hit. And so not sure if but that was the way they described her hitting. The last person that I wanted to spend just a couple minutes talking about is Maud Nelson, whose career also started in the 19th century. Born in Italy, her real name was Clementina Brida, moved to the US when she was just 2 or 3 years old, and later changed her name. You'll find her name spelled often as Nelson or Nielsen. And then after she marries John Olson, you'd also see her listed as Maud Olson as well. So it's kind of hard to keep track of her. But what I tried to build here for the first time for you is sort of where she played over the course of her career from the mid 1890s all the way through till the mid 1930s. She had a 40-year career where she played, managed, and owned these various teams. Got her start with the New York Bloomers, and you can see the others that she played with or managed. John Olson Jr. was the manager of the Chicago Stars in the early 1900s, and that's who she later married. And so they owned, and often she owned a team, but would be playing with other teams. And so that's why it's sometimes hard. But I literally have now hundreds of articles of teams that she played with, which is kind of cool to put together her record. This is one of the more interesting teams that she played for. This is a picture from 1917 of the All-American Ladies Baseball Club, one of the ones that she owned. This does not have her in the picture, but just thought I'd show you this particular photograph. Not a great one pulling it out of the newspaper, but here are a couple broadsides of her with the Cherokee Indian Baseball Club, one with the Western Bloomer Girls. That's probably her most well-known team that they started after they moved to Watervliet, Michigan. She owned the team. When she was with the Cherokee team, they actually had their own Pullman Railroad car that would advertise her and the team on the side of it. Later with the Western Bloomer Girls, they would tell people, if you want us to come play in your town, don't worry if you don't have a stadium for us. Don't worry if you just have an open field, because we carry around our own fencing. And they had 1,200 feet of fencing that they could put up to create, and it would have the team's logo or name on it and everything, so they could advertise the team. And so Nelson pitched most of the time, but she also played first, second, and sometimes even third base. And so she kind of played a little bit of the infield as well. A couple other pieces from the All-Star Ranger Girls Baseball Club, which was also hers. You can see at the top, it says Maud Nelson Olson. So this is after she was married. And then you'll notice on the top right-hand corner of that, you'll see the name C. Delacroix. That's her second husband, who was also involved with the baseball teams. Bottom one is just another example of the Rangers baseball team playing in a variety of different places. And here are just a couple of examples of, if you're looking, 3 of these ladies have the only books written about them, and they are all children's books, but they give you, so we have Amanda Clements on the left, and Lizzie Murphy's, and Alta Weiss. Maud Nelson, who has the longest career of all of them, has no particular book or anything written about her, which is kind of fascinating. Got a woman with a 40-year career who was known most, like the others, for her speed, for her curveball. But there were great discussions about all 3 of them and whether or not they threw a spitball, which was kind of an interesting. And Alta Weiss was the one, and then Maud Nelson followed, saying there were articles at times where they said no, they wouldn't throw a spitball because a spitball was dirty and it wasn't good for the game. And then Maud Nelson said that she could do it because she, instead of chewing tobacco, she'd chew bubble gum, and that would make sure that she had what she needed to be able to throw a good spitball. But Nelson was also, unlike Alta Weiss, who was not known much for her hitting, Maud Nelson was known for her pitching, her fielding, and descriptions talking about her as a good hitter. But most of the stories tended to talk about the curveball that she threw. And they would talk about it. One description was her curveball was perfectly lovely. Not sure what that means, but that was generally the way she was described. In 2011, her home in Watervliet, where she and Olson lived for many years, actually held a festival in her honor for the first time. And it included a baseball tournament for 4 girls teams of young girls between the ages of 13 and 16. And so they held a tournament over the weekend of June in 2011, which was kind of a cool idea. And so just a little bit of a look at, I guess you'd say, 4 pioneers in the women's game at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. And that can certainly tell you more, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody has as well.
Hey, Leslie, this is Corky. Thank you for sharing this. I don't know if you were on during Alan Stair's presentation on umpiring.
Yes, I was.
One of the things that came up as an umpire, we try really hard to explain what's going on. Sometimes we have to wave our hands when there's anachronisms going on and talk to it. And one of the things that I've always struggled with, mostly because I don't have the research, is that, we have women that play in vintage baseball. We understand the first women's team, 1866 at Vassar. But is it safe now, based on what you were presenting here, that we could say Lizzie Arlington in 1898 would have been the first time women would have played baseball with men?
It wasn't with men. It was because there were certainly others that were playing with and against men. What we find with Lizzie Arlington is that it's the first time we find a woman so far playing actually in a minor league game.
So if we wanted to say the first time women integrated with men in a game, what would be the safe thing to say?
Late 1880s.
Late 1880s. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Would there have been other times prior to that where the women would just dress up like men, like that would have happened in the Revolutionary War and the Civil War and whatever, in order to get into?
You know what? That's a fascinating question, Gary, and that's a lot harder to answer because for whatever, and I think it has a lot. Well, I know it has a lot to do with both attitudes of the time period and then the way the media addressed this. You don't find much discussion about women dressing as men. Instead, what you find is men dressing as women. So here's a good example. There's a guy by the name of Otto Hensey, who got himself caught, got some coverage where he was playing himself off as Maud Nelson. And so he actually took her name and would dress as a woman and join teams and claim that he was Maud Nelson. So instead, that's more what we read about is men dressing because, and there are a number of cases, but that's probably the most famous one where they thought that would help the team's publicity by, which is really interesting to think about, by him claiming to play as the famous Maud Nelson instead of as himself, and that would bring in more publicity by doing that. So that's the kind of thing you read more about rather than the reverse. Now, are there likely to have been, since we know that they did it in so many other circumstances? Probably. But unfortunately, the only times we tend to find out about it, and this sounds terrible to put it this way, but it is when they get caught, right? Is when they get found out. And so unless they get found out, that it's not something that newspapers and things are going to cover.
CK Hendricks wants to know what was the address of the women's all-star team?
The
KC Hendricks, sorry.
The actual address of which one?
It has in the chat, what was the address?
Address of the women's all-star team. Yeah, and I'm not sure which one there were, because there were a number of all-star teams. You're talking about the one that Lizie Arlington was on?
Rudy, can you unmute Casey? Maybe he can just.
Yeah, I've asked.
Oh.
Hello?
Yep.
Yeah,
ahead,
it was a couple
Steve.
slides back under Maud Nelson. I think it said 4918 North Sheridan Road.
Oh, let me go back and see, because you caught, yes, 4918 Sheridan Road, Chicago, Illinois. That would be correct.
Was that a stadium or her
No, that was
house
just,
or-
no, that was just simply where their mail got sent when they were sending out mail and trying to find challengers to play.
Oh, okay.
So they just claimed that as their headquarters.
Huh. Thanks.
Sure.
Any other questions?
Yeah, Leslie,
Yes.
did the ladies back in the 1800s play pretty much the same rules as the men? Underhanded pitching until the 1880s. Anything else? Same distance around the bases?
From what we know and where you can find articles that actually talk about that, because that's generally not something that they tended to focus on a great deal, unfortunately, we assume so. But we can't always 100% say that was true.
Thank you.
That's a good question.
Leslie, one last question. Are you familiar with Rebecca Tulloch at all? Rebecca does this reenactment of the ball teams of the the Wrigley teams.
Right. I don't, I know the name, but I don't know her specifically.
You'll have to, the two of you need to connect because she's obviously passionate about the women in baseball, and I
There's
think in her
also-
real job, she's like a producer or something
Okay,
for.
because there's also a woman who does a reenactment of Alta Weiss,
Okay,
and I know
Yeah.
her quite well, so that's,
so you know her from that production. I got it. But
Yep.
the two of you should have a conversation. I'm thinking there'd be some good stuff going on between the two of you. Thank you. Thanks for presenting today. This is
oh, my
really
pleasure. Thanks for asking.
something we don't get enough of, so thank you.
Sure.